The stagecoach lurched sideways and Sable Dunmore pressed her palm flat against the wooden seat to steady herself. Dust poured through the cracked leather curtain like flour through a sieve, coating her navy blue dress in a fine layer of brown that no amount of brushing would remove. She had stopped trying somewhere around the Wyoming border 3 days and 400 miles ago when she realized that the West did not care about clean hems or pressed sleeves or any of the small dignities she had carried with her from Boston. Her valise sat beside her on the bench, a small leather case with a broken clasp that she kept shut with a strip of ribbon from her sewing kit. Inside it was everything she owned in this world. 2 spare chemises, a bone comb, a Bible with her mother's name written on the inside cover in ink so faded it looked like a ghost's handwriting, a thimble, 3 spools of thread, and tucked into the silk lining, folded so carefully that the creases had become part of the paper itself, 3 letters. She did not need to read them again. She had memorized every word somewhere between Pennsylvania and the Missouri River, reading them by candlelight in boarding houses that smelled of bacon grease and strangers' tobacco, reading them on rattling train cars while the continent unspooled outside her window like a bolt of cloth with no end. She knew the handwriting better than she knew her own face. Neat, deliberate strokes. A man who took his time with words the way a carpenter took his time with joints, measuring twice before committing ink to paper. The first letter had arrived at the boarding house in Boston 6 weeks ago, forwarded from the Matrimonial Times where Sable had placed her advertisement with shaking hands and the last of her wages. Respectable young woman of good character seeks correspondence with gentlemen of honest means, willing to relocate. No fortune but a willing heart and capable hands. She had expected nothing. She had received Cormac Ashford. Dear Miss Dunmore, the first letter began, I am a rancher in the Montana Territory. I have land, livestock, and a house that keeps the rain out most days. I am not a man of many words, but I will give you the truth of things. It is lonely here. The mountains are beautiful, but they do not talk back. I am looking for a wife, not a servant. Someone to share the quiet with. If that sounds like something you could bear, I would be honored to hear from you. Sable had written back the same night, her pen moving faster than her caution. She told him about the orphanage on Beacon Street, where she had grown up pressing her face against the window glass, watching families walk past on the sidewalk below, counting the children who held their mother's hands. She told him about learning to sew because it was the only trade the nuns taught girls who had no prospects. She told him she had never been loved by anyone who was not paid to care for her, and she was not sorry for herself, only tired of it, the way a person gets tired of rain that never stops. His second letter came faster than she expected. It spoke of the creek that ran beside his cabin, how it froze in winter and sang in spring. It spoke of the stars which he said were close enough to touch if a man stood on his porch and reached. It spoke of silence not as emptiness, but as a kind of language, and Sable had felt something shift inside her chest when she read that line. Something old and locked clicking open like a door she had forgotten was there. By the third letter she had made her decision. She would go. Now the stagecoach was slowing. The driver, an old man named Gulliver Nye with a jaw like a shovel blade and eyes permanently narrowed against decades of prairie wind, pulled the horses to a stop. Through the curtain, Sable saw a scattering of wooden buildings clinging to the base of a mountain range, so vast and indifferent that the town looked like an afterthought. A sign nailed to a post read, Bitter Creek, in letters that had once been red, but had faded to the color of dried blood. Sable gathered her valise and stepped down. The air hit her first, thin, dry, sharp with pine and distance, nothing like the wet salt air of Boston Harbor. This air had teeth. It bit her lungs and made her eyes water, and she stood there blinking in the late afternoon light, one hand on her valise and the other pressed to her stomach, which had been in knots since dawn. No one was waiting for her. She looked up and down the single dirt street, a general store with a sagging porch, a blacksmith shop trailing smoke, a small church with a crooked steeple, 2 horses tied to a rail swishing flies, an old dog sleeping in the shade. No tall rancher with honest eyes and careful handwriting. No one at all. Gulliver Nye was unhitching the lead horse when he paused and looked back at her. His face was not unkind, but it carried the particular bluntness of a man who had delivered too many people to places they did not fully understand. You are the second one they have ordered, he said. Sable turned sharply. What? But Gulliver was already leading the horse toward the water trough, and he did not repeat himself, and the words hung in the thin mountain air like a bell struck once and left to fade. The second one. The second one they ordered. Before the panic could fully take root, a voice came from behind her. You must be the Ashford bride. Sable turned. A woman stood on the porch of the general store, arms folded across a flour-dusted apron. Silver hair pulled back in a knot so tight it seemed to lift her eyebrows. She was perhaps 60, built like a fence post, with a face that suggested she had seen everything the frontier could produce and had not been impressed by any of it. I am Temperance Boyle, the woman said. I own this store, such as it is. Come inside before you fall over. Sable followed her into the dim interior, past barrels of salt pork and shelves of tinned goods and bolts of rough calico. Temperance poured her a cup of tea from a pot that sat permanently on the iron stove in the corner and set it on the counter without ceremony. Drink that. You look like a sheet on a clothesline. Sable wrapped her hands around the cup. The warmth steadied her. Mrs. Boyle, the driver, said something. He said I was the second one they ordered. What did he mean? Temperance studied her for a long moment, the way a person studies a horse before deciding whether to buy it. That is their story to tell, not mine. But I will say this. I have known the Ashford boys for 15 years. They are the most hard-headed men in Montana Territory, but they are decent. Decent enough that whatever happened before, it was not their doing. What happened before? Their story, Temperance repeated, and her tone closed the door on further questions. Then she softened just slightly, the way granite softens when light hits it at a certain angle. God help you, girl. Those boys are good, but they are wild as the mountain itself. Boys, plural. Sable set the cup down. How many of them are there? Temperance's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. You will see. She saw at sunset. The light was bleeding gold across the valley floor when she heard them coming. Not one horse. 3. The sound of hooves on packed earth rose from the trail like a drumbeat, steady and deliberate, and Sable stood on the porch of the general store with her valise at her feet and watched 3 riders come down from the mountain. They emerged from the tree line single file, then spread apart as the trail widened, and the first thing Sable noticed was their size. All 3 of them were enormous. Tall and broad-shouldered in a way that made the horses beneath them look ordinary, and they moved with the easy, synchronized rhythm of men who had spent their entire lives within arm's reach of one another. The one in front dismounted first. He was the tallest, with dark chestnut hair that fell past his collar, and eyes the color of raw amber, the kind of amber that holds light inside it and gives it back slowly. His face was weathered-lined at the corners of his eyes, and along his jaw, not from age but from years of squinting into wind and sun. He removed his hat and held it against his chest, and there was something in that gesture, something careful and almost courtly that did not match the rest of him, the scarred hands, the sun-darkened skin, the breadth of his shoulders straining against a worn cotton shirt. Miss Dunmore! His voice was low, unhurried, like stones settling at the bottom of a river. I am Cormac Ashford. These are my brothers, Declan and Phineas. Sable looked past him. The second man had not dismounted. He sat his horse with his arms crossed over his chest, jaw tight, watching her with the frank, measuring look of a man who had already made up his mind and did not like what he saw. He was slightly shorter than Cormac, but wider through the chest, and there was a coiled energy in him, a barely contained restlessness, like a loaded spring. A scar traced a pale line from his left shoulder down toward his collarbone, visible where his shirt collar opened. The third brother was already on the ground a step behind Cormac, holding his hat in both hands and turning it by the brim in slow circles. He was the youngest. Sable could see that immediately, and though he shared the same amber eyes and hard jaw as his brothers, there was something softer in his face, something unfinished, as though the wilderness had not yet carved away all the gentleness he had been born with. His ears were faintly red. 3 men, 3 brothers. She had come 1,000 miles to marry one man, and there were 3. Your letter did not mention brothers, Sable said. She kept her voice level, though her palms were damp against the fabric of her skirt. Cormac met her gaze. He did not flinch, but something shifted behind his eyes, a flicker of something that might have been shame. I know. I am sorry for that. I thought if I told the truth, you would not come. You thought right, Sable said. The one on the horse, Declan let out a short, humorless laugh. I told you this would not work. Declan, one word from Cormac, just the name. But Declan closed his mouth as though a hand had pressed it shut, and Sable understood in that single moment the architecture of this family. Cormac did not lead by volume. He led by weight, by the sheer gravitational pull of his presence, the way a mountain does not need to shout to hold the valley in place. The youngest Phineas stepped forward. He was still turning his hat, and Sable noticed that his fingers were stained with ink along the knuckles and beneath the nails, the kind of stain that comes from long hours with a pen. Miss Dunmore, please do not decide yet. At least come see the ranch. If you want to leave, we will bring you back here and pay for your passage home. You have my word. There was something in his voice, a quality she could not name at first, though it tugged at something familiar, something she almost recognized. It was not his words, which were simple enough. It was the way he spoke them, the rhythm, the careful placing of each phrase as though words were precious things that deserved attention. She had heard that rhythm before. She had read it over and over by candlelight in a Boston boarding house. But she did not say so. Not yet. She only nodded. The ride up the mountain took nearly 3 hours. The trail climbed through forests of ponderosa pines so tall and straight, they looked like the pillars of a cathedral built by something older than any church. Creeks crossed the path in silver threads, and at one point they passed through a meadow of dying wildflowers, where a herd of elk stood motionless, watching them pass with the calm, unblinking stare of animals that had never learned to fear humans. Sable rode a chestnut mare that Phineas led by a rope, and she noticed that the three brothers arranged themselves around her without discussion, as though they had rehearsed it. Cormac in front, Declan behind. Phineas beside her, close enough to catch the reins if the horse spooked. It was protection, instinctive, effortless, and absolute. They moved through the wilderness the way wolves move through their own territory, aware of every sound, every shadow, every shift in the wind, and Sable realized that whatever else these men were, they were native to this place in a way she would never be. The Ashford Ranch sat in a small valley hidden behind a ridge, and when they crested the final rise and Sable saw it spread below her, she felt her breath leave her body. A two-story log cabin stood near a creek, solid and square with a stone chimney trailing a thin line of smoke. A barn, a tool shed, a chicken coop, a vegetable garden, gone brown with autumn. Beyond the buildings, the valley opened into rolling grassland, where cattle grazed in clusters, and beyond the grassland, the mountains rose on every side, enormous and blue and ancient, and the sky above them was so wide and so empty that Sable felt something close to vertigo, as though the world had suddenly become too large to comprehend. This is it, Cormac said, not boasting, just stating fact. Home. Inside the cabin was exactly what she had expected and nothing she had hoped for. Clean, functional, bare. The walls were hewn logs sealed with clay. The floor was rough planking covered in places by animal hides. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and a heavy wooden table with 4 mismatched chairs sat in the center of the room. There were no curtains, no flowers, no cloth on the table, no color anywhere except the orange glow of the fire and the dark brown of wood and leather. The air smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and the faint permanent tang of men who worked outdoors and bathed when time allowed. It was a shelter, not a home. The difference was obvious and absolute. Cormac showed her to a small room on the upper floor, accessible by a steep staircase, more like a ladder than a proper stairs. The room held a narrow cot, a washstand with a chip-end basin, and a single window that looked out over the valley. The glass was wavy and imperfect, but through it, Sable could see the creek and the mountains beyond, painted in the last red light of sunset. "This is yours," Cormac said. "We sleep below. You will not be disturbed." Declan's voice drifted up from downstairs, muttering something about giving up beds for strangers, and Cormac's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. That first evening, Sable did not eat. She sat on the cot and listened to the sounds of the house beneath her, the low murmur of voices, the clang of a pot, footsteps on the plank floor heavy and rhythmic, and beneath it all, the sound of the wind outside moving through the pines like breath through a harmonica, long and low and lonely. She unfolded the 3 letters and laid them on the blanket beside her. She ran her fingers over the handwriting, and she thought about ink stains on knuckles and she thought about a voice that arranged words with the care of a man laying stones, and something that had been hovering at the edge of her understanding settled into certainty. She knew who wrote these letters, and it was not Cormac Ashford. She waited until the house went quiet, until Cormac's heavy tread moved out toward the barn, where he apparently slept most nights, and until Declan's boots stopped pacing on the floorboards below. Then she crept down the steep stairs barefoot, her hand trailing along the rough log wall for balance. The kitchen was lit by a single candle. Phineas sat at the table with a sheet of paper before him and a pen in his right hand. Beside the paper was a book spine cracked, pages soft with use. He had not heard her come down. His head was bent over his work, and in the candlelight his face had lost its daytime guardedness. He looked younger, open, almost peaceful the way people look when they believe they are alone with the truest version of themselves. Sable stood in the doorway and looked at the paper. She did not need to read the words. She recognized the handwriting the way she would recognize a voice in a crowd instantly, completely beyond all doubt. "You wrote those letters," she said. It was not a question. Phineas's hand froze. The pen stopped mid-stroke and a small bead of ink pooled at its tip and fell onto the paper like a black tear. He turned slowly and his face went through several things at once, surprise, then fear, then something that looked like relief, as though a weight he had been carrying for months had suddenly shifted, not lifted but shifted, and the new position was strange enough to make him breathe differently. "Miss Dunmore, Cormac did not write them. You did." He set the pen down carefully. He rubbed both hands over his face, and when he lowered them, his eyes were tired and honest. "Cormac does not write well. He reads some, but writing shames him. He asked me to write on his behalf. The ideas, the thoughts, they were his. I just put them down." Sable sat across from him. The candle flame leaned between them in a draft. Were they all his thoughts, or did you write from yourself?" The silence lasted long enough to become its own answer. Phineas looked at the paper, at the pen, at the ink stains spreading on the grain of the wood, at everything in the room except her eyes. And his silence told her what his words could not. She did not push further. There was a boundary here, thin and fragile as river ice in early spring, and she could feel it under her feet, could feel how easily it would crack if either of them shifted their weight. So she stood and she said, "Good night, Phineas." And she went back up the stairs, and she lay in the dark with her hand over her heart, feeling it beat against her palm like a bird trapped behind glass. The days that followed moved with the slow, relentless rhythm of ranch life, and Sable found herself absorbed into it the way a stone is absorbed by a river, not all at once, but gradually, the current wearing away her edges until she fit the shape of the place. She cooked, though badly at first. Yeah, mouse. The first time she attempted biscuits, they came out of the iron stove so hard and flat that Declan picked one up, turned it over in his enormous hand, carried it out to the porch, and set it on the railing without a word. The look on his face said everything his mouth did not. Phineas ate his without complaint, though Sable saw him quietly feed half of it to the dog when he thought she was not watching. Cormac ate the entire thing, chewing slowly, and when he finished, he said, "Better than what we had before," which Sable later learned was bread made from flour and water and nothing else. She swept the floors. She mended clothes so worn they were more patch than original fabric. She washed dishes in the creek because the cabin had no pump, kneeling on the bank with her sleeves rolled up and her hands burning in the cold water. And she did not complain, not once, because complaining required an audience that would listen, and she had learned at the orphanage that self-pity was a luxury reserved for people who had other options. Slowly, she began to change things. She sewed curtains from a bolt of calico she found in the storeroom, faded blue flowers on a cream background, and hung them in the kitchen window. She arranged wildflowers, the last of the season, in a tin cup on the table. She found a scrap of checkered cloth and made a rough cover for the table. And the first morning it appeared, all three brothers stopped in the doorway and stared at it as though a foreign object had materialized in their house, which in a sense it had. It was color. It was softness. It was the unmistakable signature of a woman's presence, and it changed the air in the cabin the way a single note changes a silence. Each brother responded to her differently, and Sable began to understand them the way a person understands weather, by observation, by pattern, by learning which signs preceded which storms. Cormac kept his distance. He was courteous always. He said good morning. He said thank you for the food. He left warm water by the stove before she woke, and once, without announcement, he built a small shelf in her room and mounted it to the wall so she would have a place for her Bible and her comb. But he never stood too close, never touched her, never let his gaze linger longer than a practical man's gaze needed to linger. And yet she felt it, his attention constant and warm and heavy, like sunlight through glass, present even when she could not see its source. Declan challenged her. He did not make it easy, and Sable suspected he did not want to. "You think mountain life is poetry," he said one morning, handing her an axe that weighed nearly as much as she did. "Winter here will kill you if you are not hard enough." He taught her to ride properly, not the side saddle perch she had learned in Boston, but the real thing, legs astride, hands firm on the reins, body moving with the horse instead of against it. He taught her to shoot, standing behind her with his arms extended alongside hers to correct her aim, and his nearness was a physical fact. She could not ignore the heat of him, the scent of leather and pine sap, the way his voice dropped to a murmur when he said, "Breathe out, then squeeze, do not pull." He taught her to read the sky for snow, the ground for tracks, the wind for the direction of approaching weather. And one afternoon when she split a round of oak with a single clean stroke, after failing 20 times, Declan looked at her. He said nothing, but the corner of his mouth moved just barely upward, and it was the first time Sable had seen him smile, and the rarity of it made it land like an arrow. Phineas was the easiest and the most dangerous. He shared books with her, the small collection he had accumulated over years carried up the mountain one or two at a time from Bitter Creek. They talked in the evenings when Cormac was checking the livestock, and Declan was doing whatever Declan did alone in the dark, and their conversations had the particular intimacy of two people who recognized in each other a hunger for something the wilderness could not provide. Language, ideas, the texture of a well-built sentence, the comfort of being understood, not just in what you said, but in what you meant beneath the saying. He carved small animals from pine and left them outside her door without explanation. A rabbit, a hawk, a small bear standing on its hind legs. Each one was detailed and precise, made with the same careful attention he gave to his handwriting, and Sable kept them on the shelf Cormac had built lined up in a row. And sometimes at night she picked them up and turned them in her fingers and tried not to think about what it meant that the man who had spoken to her soul through 3 letters was not the man she was expected to marry. One evening when the first hard frost had turned the valley white and the air inside the cabin was thick with wood smoke and the smell of boiling venison, Sable asked about their parents. The silence that followed was unlike any silence she had known. It was not absence, it was presence, a living thing that pressed against the walls and filled the space between the 3 brothers like water filling a hull. Cormac was the one who finally spoke. His voice was flat, controlled, stripped of everything except fact. 15 years ago, raiders hit our ranch down south. Pa was shot in the yard. And your mother. The pause lasted 3 heartbeats. Sable counted them in her own chest. Ma went away, Cormac said. Not died, not was killed, went away, as though she had left of her own will, packed a bag and walked into the sunset. But the words were wrong. They did not match the way Cormac said them, the way his jaw locked and his hands curled and his eyes went somewhere far away and old. Went away was a door painted over a hole, and Sable could see the edges of the hole clearly, but she did not pry. Declan stood abruptly, his chair scraping the floor like a shout, and walked out of the cabin, closing the door hard behind him. Phineas looked down at his hands and said nothing, and in his silence, Sable heard the echo of a 7-year-old boy who had lost his mother and had been running from that loss ever since, running into books and words and the inner life of the mind, because the outer world had proven itself capable of taking everything. Sable did not ask more, but she noted the word. Went away. She folded it and placed it in the part of her mind where she kept things that mattered but were not yet understood, alongside the ink stains on Phineas's knuckles, and the scar on Declan's shoulder, and the way Cormac checked the door locks 3 times every night before he finally let himself sleep. And she noted something else found 2 days later while looking for a sewing needle in the old storage cupboard beside the storeroom. A scrap of white cloth tucked behind a stack of dusty tin plates bearing the beginning of an embroidery. Wild roses, red and blue thread on white fabric, the stitches small and expert and heartbreakingly precise. The kind of work that came from a woman who understood cloth and needle the way Sable herself did, as a language, as a form of devotion, as a way of making beauty where the world provided none. The embroidery stopped mid-flower. A needle still hung from the last stitch rusted. Now the thread gone brittle with age, as though the hands that held it had been called away suddenly and had never returned. Sable brought it to the kitchen table that evening, their dinner. She held it up without a word. Three brothers looked at it. Three faces changed. Phineas spoke first, and his voice was very quiet. That was Ma's. Sable looked at the unfinished rose, at the rusted needle, at the thread that time had made fragile but not broken, and she understood something about this family that she had not understood before. This was not simply a house where a mother had been lost. This was a house where a mother had been interrupted, where her presence still lived in the things she had touched and left behind, and where three boys had grown into men around the shape of her absence, the way a tree grows around a stone, incorporating it, carrying it, never quite absorbing it. She hung the embroidery on the kitchen wall beside the shelf where Phineas's carved animals stood in their careful row. No one told her to. No one told her not to. And from that day forward, the unfinished roses were part of the cabin's landscape, a small piece of evidence that someone had been here before Sable, someone who had held a needle the way she held a needle, someone who had tried to make beauty in a place that made survival difficult and beauty nearly impossible. It was a thread, thin and old and nearly broken, but it connected something in the past to something in the present, and Sable could feel it taut against her fingers every time she passed the wall and saw those wild roses waiting, still waiting for the hand that would finish them. 2 weeks after Sable arrived at the Ashford Ranch, the riders came. There were four of them. They appeared on the ridge at mid-morning silhouettes against a sky the color of old tin. They descended single file, their horses moving with the deliberate slowness of men who wanted to be seen coming. And by the time they reached the fence line, Cormac was standing on the porch with his arms at his sides and his face composed into the particular stillness of a man preparing for something he has been expecting. Their leader dismounted first. He was a thick-bodied man in a canvas duster coat, with a face that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts, heavy brow, flat nose, thin mouth, and eyes that moved constantly, cataloging everything: the cabin, the barn, the windows, the sight lines, the number of exits. He wore a battered cavalry hat and carried a repeating rifle in a saddle scabbard, and there was a quality to his movements, precise, economical, alert, that marked him as a man who had been trained to violence and had never fully left it behind. "Ashford," he called from the gate. "Depends who is asking. Name is Virgil Skaggs. I am a licensed recovery agent operating under contract from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts." He reached into his coat and produced a folded document, holding it up the way a preacher holds a Bible. "I am tracking a fugitive. Young woman, early 20s, goes by Sable Dunmore. Wanted for grand theft of personal property, jewelry, and cash money from the household of Harmon Osgood of Boston. Reward of $50 for her capture and return." Inside the cabin, Sable stood behind the window, one hand pressed against the wall, the other against her own mouth. Her blood had gone cold, not the cold of winter, but the cold of recognition. The cold that comes when you understand that the past you thought you had outrun has been running too, and it is faster than you are. Harmon Osgood. The name hit her like a fist. She could smell his office again, the cigar smoke and leather polish, and the sour sweetness of whiskey on his breath. She could feel his hand on her wrist, the grip that left bruises shaped like fingers. She could hear her own voice saying no, and his laugh, the laugh of a man who had never heard that word from a woman he considered his property. She could feel the push both hands against his chest, the shock on his face as he stumbled backward, the crack of his skull against the desk, the blood on the mahogany, and then her own feet running down the stairs and out the door and into the night streets of Boston with nothing but the clothes on her back and the certain knowledge that her life there was over. She had stolen nothing. She had taken nothing except her own body, which he had tried to claim, and her own dignity, which he had tried to destroy, and now he was reaching across 1,000 miles of wilderness to punish her for the crime of refusing him. On the porch, Cormac had not moved. "There is no woman here," he said. His voice was level. His face gave nothing. Skaggs's eyes slid past Cormac's shoulder, and Sable saw the exact moment his gaze found the curtains. The calico curtains she had sewn and hung in the kitchen window. Blue flowers on cream, the unmistakable signature of a woman's presence in a house full of men. Skaggs smiled. It was not a good smile. You sure about that, Ashford? The barn door opened, and Declan stepped out. He held his Winchester rifle across his body, not aimed at anyone, but not exactly at ease either. He walked to the porch and stood beside Cormac, and the two of them together, shoulder to shoulder, formed a wall of muscle and silence that would give any reasonable man pause. From the corner of the tool shed, Phineas appeared. He carried no weapon, but he positioned himself at the angle that completed the triangle covering the approach from the side, and Sable understood that this was not improvised. They had done this before. Not this exact situation, perhaps, but something like it. They had stood together against outsiders, and the geometry of their defense was instinctive, born of years of protecting what was theirs. Skaggs looked at Declan. He looked at Phineas. He looked back at Cormac. He counted 3 large men armed on their own land in a territory where the law was thin, and the distance between help and harm was measured in days, not minutes. His smile did not waver, but something behind it recalculated. I will be back, he said, with proper papers this time. He mounted his horse. His men followed. They rode back up the ridge without hurry, and Cormac stood on the porch and watched until the dust was gone and the ridge was empty, and the silence had reassembled itself over the valley like water closing over a stone. Then he went inside. Sable was standing in the kitchen, her back against the wall, her hands gripping her elbows so tightly that the knuckles were white. She was shaking not violently, but in the small, continuous way of a person whose body has decided to be afraid whether the mind agrees or not. Cormac stopped in the doorway. Behind him, Declan came in and leaned against the wall, arms folded. Phineas closed the door and stood beside it. The cabin felt very small suddenly, 4 people and too much truth crowding into a room that could barely hold the furniture. They came looking, Cormac said. Showed me a paper. Said you were wanted. Sable nodded, and then because she had no more room for secrets, because the weight of them was greater than the fear of what would happen when she set them down, she told them everything. She told them about Boston, about the orphanage and the sewing shop, and Harmon Osgood, who owned the shop, and 30 others like it, who was rich and respected, and sat in the front pew at Trinity Church every Sunday with his wife and 4 children. She told them about the evening that he called her into his office and locked the door, about his hands and his breath, and the certainty in his voice when he told her that no one would believe her, that she was nothing, an orphan, a seamstress, a girl with no name and no family and no power in a world that ran on all 3. She told them how she pushed him. Both hands, how he fell backward and struck his head on the desk and bled onto the carpet. How she ran, how the next morning before the bruises on her wrist had faded, she saw her own name in the newspaper not as a victim, but as a thief wanted for the theft of jewelry she had never touched, money she had never seen, crimes invented by a man whose pride was wounded worse than his skull. I did not steal anything, she said. Her voice was steady now, the shaking transferred from her body to something deeper, something structural. I have never stolen anything in my life. But he is a rich man, and I am no one, and the law does not weigh those 2 things equally. The silence that followed was long and full. Then Declan spoke. Not Cormac, not Phineas. Declan, the one who had not wanted her here, who had questioned her presence from the first moment, who had made her earn every inch of ground she stood on. Where would you go? He said. His voice was not gentle. It was not soft. It was practical, direct, stripped of sentiment, which was exactly what made it land. If you leave here, they find you in a week. Out there, you are alone. Up here, you are not. It was the first time Declan had defended her. He did not do it with flowers or promises or reassurance. He did it with the blunt arithmetic of survival, the cold, clear calculation of a man who understood that the world was not fair and that the best you could do was choose your ground and hold it. Cormac looked at his brother. Something passed between them, something old and wordless. A conversation conducted entirely in the language of men who had raised each other in the wilderness. Then Cormac looked at Sable. You stay, he said. We will handle what comes. And with those words spoken quietly in a cabin on a mountain, in a territory that did not yet have a name, on most maps, Sable Dunmore became part of the Ashford family. Not by ceremony, not by contract, not by any of the proper channels through which society organized its affections and its obligations. She became theirs the way a stone becomes part of a reservoir by being placed there deliberately by hands that understood what they were building and why it mattered. Outside, the wind picked up. The first clouds of what would be a long and brutal winter moved across the sky like gray ships. The mountains stood where they had always stood, indifferent and enormous, keeping their counsel. And somewhere on the ridge, riding toward the nearest telegraph office, Virgil Skaggs was already composing his next move, because men like Skaggs did not give up. They simply changed tactics, but that was a problem for another day. Tonight there was firelight and the smell of coffee and the sound of 4 people breathing in a house that for the first time in 15 years felt like something more than shelter. Tonight there was the beginning of something. Winter arrived without warning, the way death arrives, not gradually, but all at once between one breath and the next. Sable woke on a Tuesday morning in late November to a world erased. The valley, the creek, the fence, post the mountains themselves, all of it buried beneath a silence so total that for one disoriented moment she thought she had gone deaf. Then she heard the wind, not the usual wind that whispered through the pines like a living thing, but a new wind, flat and heavy and relentless, pressing against the cabin walls with the dull patience of something that intended to stay. She pulled the blanket tighter and went to the window. Snow. Not the soft, decorative snow she had seen in Boston, the kind that melted on cobblestones by noon and turned the common into a Christmas card. This was different. This was snow as geography, as architecture, as a reorganization of the physical world. It covered everything to a depth of 3 feet and was still falling, thick curtains of white, descending from a sky that had no color at all, no gray, no blue, just a blank expanse of nothing, as though God had decided to start over and was laying down the primer coat. The trail to Bitter Creek was gone. Not blocked, not difficult. Gone. Buried beneath a weight of snow that would not melt until April, and with it went the mail. The supplies, the possibility of outside help, and any remaining illusion that Sable's life on this mountain was temporary. She was here. They were here. 4 people in a cabin made for 2 with enough dried meat, flour, salt, and coffee to last until spring, if they were careful, and nothing to do but survive each other. In the first week of the siege, because that was what it felt like, a siege, Sable established the rhythm that would carry them through. She rose before dawn when the cold inside the cabin was so sharp it turned her breath into ghosts, and she built the fire. Not the way she had built fires in Boston with kindling and paper and the timid prodding of a woman who feared the flame. She built it the way Declan had taught her, with purpose, with confidence, stacking the logs in a pyramid, leaving gaps for air striking the flint, with a motion that had become muscle memory over the past weeks. By the time the flames caught and the first wave of heat pushed back the cold, she had the coffee pot on the stove and the oats in the pot and the table set with 4 tin plates and 4 tin cups. And when the brothers emerged from their bedrolls on the floor below, blinking and stiff, the cabin was already warm and the smell of food was already in the air. It was a small thing, breakfast. But Sable understood with the instinct of a woman who had grown up without a family that small things were the architecture of belonging. The meal was not important. The ritual was. The fact that someone had risen in the dark and built the fire and prepared the food and set the table, that someone cared whether they ate, whether they were warm, whether the day began with something other than cold and silence. That was the thing that held people together when everything else fell away. Cormac noticed first. He came to the table one morning, sat down, wrapped his hands around the hot cup of coffee, and looked at her across the table with those amber eyes that held light, the way his letters, Phineas's letters, held meaning in layers, in depths, that revealed themselves slowly. He did not say anything extraordinary. He said, "Thank you." But the way he said it, low and rough and stripped of everything except sincerity, made the 2 words feel like something heavier, something that had been waiting a long time to be said. Sable looked at him across the steam rising from his cup and nodded, and the nod held everything she could not say either, which was that she had spent 22 years on this earth, and no one had ever thanked her for simply being present, for simply caring enough to rise in the dark and make the day begin. Declan noticed too, though he would have denied it under torture. He stopped complaining about the food. He stopped muttering about strangers and disruption and the natural order of things. One morning, without announcement, he brought in extra firewood and stacked it beside the stove so Sable would not have to go outside into the freezing dark to fetch it. He did not mention this. She did not mention this. But they both knew, and the knowing was enough. As the weeks passed and the snow deepened and the world outside the cabin shrank to a white blankness, interrupted only by the dark lines of the nearest trees, the dynamics inside the cabin shifted. Four people sharing a small space could not maintain the polite distances of strangers. The cabin forced intimacy, not the intimacy of bodies, but the intimacy of habits, of rhythms, of the thousand small revelations that come from watching someone live their life at close range. Sable learned that Cormac snored softly on his left side, that Declan paced when he was anxious, walking slow circles near the door like a caged animal measuring the walls, that Phineas read with his lips moving, slightly forming the words in silence, and that when he came to a passage that moved him, his hand would stop turning the page, and he would sit very still as though listening to something only he could hear. They learned her too, that she hummed when she sewed always the same melody, a hymn from the orphanage she did not even realize she remembered, that she talked to the fire while she built it quiet encouragements as though the flames were alive and needed coaxing. Come on, now, a little more, that is right. That she cried in her sleep, sometimes not loudly, just a thin sound like wind through a crack in the wall, and that when she did, Cormac would lie awake below her room and stare at the ceiling and press his fists against his eyes and not go to her, because going to her would mean crossing a line he had drawn with all the precision of a man who knew exactly how much he could not afford to lose. The storm that tested them came in the third week of December, a blizzard so violent that it bent the pines sideways and drove snow through cracks in the wall that Sable did not know existed. The wind screamed, the cabin groaned, the fire in the hearth guttered and swayed as drafts found their way inside, and at one point around midnight, a branch the size of a man's leg crashed against the roof with a sound like a cannon shot, and Sable, sitting alone by the fire, because sleep was impossible, let out a cry before she could stop herself. She pressed her hand over her mouth, ashamed. She was not a child. She had survived worse than weather. She had survived Harmon Osgood's hands in the streets of Boston at night, in a 1,000-mile journey into the unknown, and she would not be undone by wind. But the cabin shook again, harder this time, and the fire dropped to embers, and the darkness closed in, and before she could stop herself, she was shaking not from cold, but from something older and deeper, the primal terror of a creature caught in a storm without shelter, even though she had shelter, even though the walls were solid, even though she was not alone. Then Cormac was there. She had not heard him come up from his bedroll. He was simply there the way the mountains were there, without announcement, without negotiation, taking up space in a way that was not intrusive but fundamental. He sat down beside her on the bench near the fire, not close enough to touch, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and he said in that low, unhurried voice that was the only voice in the world that made silence feel like a choice rather than a punishment, "This cabin has stood 20 years. It will not fall tonight." Sable looked at him. The firelight moved across his face, and she saw what he kept hidden from the daylight. Not weakness, loneliness. The deep structural loneliness of a man who had been the strong one for 15 years, who had raised two brothers in the wilderness, who had built this cabin and this ranch and this life with his own hands, and had never not once allowed himself to want anything for himself. He had wanted for his brothers. He had provided. He had endured. But wanting for himself, wanting a hand to hold his, a voice to answer his in the dark, a presence beside him, that was not obligation but choice. That was a door he had locked so long ago that he had almost forgotten what was behind it. Almost, but not quite. Because the letters he had dictated to Phineas, the ideas and feelings he had poured into his brother's careful handwriting, had been the key turning in that lock. And Sable was what he had found on the other side, and the terror in his eyes was not of the storm. It was of the possibility that he had finally allowed himself to hope. "I am not going anywhere," Sable said softly. Cormac did not answer, but he stayed beside her until the storm passed and the fire rebuilt itself from its embers, and the first gray light of morning crept through the frosted window. And when she finally fell asleep sitting upright on the bench, with her head tilted sideways, he reached out and caught her before she slid, and he eased her down so that her head rested on the folded blanket he placed on the bench beside him, and he sat there with his hand near her hair, but not touching it, not touching anything, just present the way a shore is present for a wave, and That was enough, and it was everything. Declan's moment came differently. It did not arrive in the warmth of the fire, but in the cold outside it, and it did not come wrapped in gentleness, but in the hard, unforgiving language of a man who had built his entire identity on the principle that vulnerability was a wound you did not show. It was a night in January, deep winter, the kind of cold that made the nails in the walls contract and pop like tiny gunshots. Sable could not sleep. She came downstairs for water and found the front door ajar, cold air pouring through it like a river. She looked outside. Declan sat on the porch, no coat, no hat, just his shirt and trousers and boots, sitting on the top step with his forearms on his knees, staring out at the snowfield that glowed faintly under a half moon. His breath came in clouds. His body was absolutely still, but there was a quality to his stillness that was not peace. It was the stillness of a man holding something down, pressing it beneath the surface with both hands, and his hands were trembling from the effort. Sable poured coffee from the pot that always sat on the stove, still warm, and carried it outside. She sat down beside him on the step. She did not speak. She held out the cup. He took it without looking at her, wrapped both hands around it, and drank. The silence lasted a long time, long enough for the moon to move behind a cloud and come back out again, long enough for an owl to call 3 times from the ridge and receive no answer. Then Declan spoke. His voice was quiet, so quiet that the wind nearly took it. When the raiders came, I was 15. I heard Ma scream. Cormac told me to run. Pick up Phineas and run. So I picked him up. He was only 7, small enough to carry, and I ran. He paused, drank more coffee. The cup shook slightly in his hands. I got to the tree line. There was an old hollow oak big enough to crawl inside. I put Phineas in it, told him to stay quiet, stay still, do not move until I came back. And I turned around. I was going to go back. I was going to help Ma. I was going to fight. His voice broke on the word fight, not dramatically, not with a bomb, but with a fracture so small that only someone sitting close enough to feel his body heat would have heard it. But Phineas grabbed my shirt, both hands. He did not cry. That was the thing. He did not make a sound, but he held on so tight that the fabric tore, and I could not make his fingers let go. I tried. I pulled. And he just held on tighter, and his eyes were so big in the dark, and he was shaking so hard I could feel it in my own bones. The moon disappeared behind a cloud. The snowfield went dark. I chose my brother over my mother, and every day since I do not know if that was right or wrong. I only know I am still alive, and she is not. He stopped. The words were gone, emptied out of him, the way water empties from a cracked jug all at once, and without control, and what was left was the container itself, the hard, scarred, weathered shell of a man who had been carrying the weight of an impossible choice for 15 years and had never until this moment set it down in front of another human being. Sable said nothing. She did not offer comfort. She did not say, "It was not your fault," or "You did the right thing," or any of the words that well-meaning people say to cauterize wounds they do not understand. She understood that Declan had not spoken because he wanted answers. He had spoken because the weight had finally exceeded what his body could hold in silence, and the only thing he needed was for someone to sit beside him while it overflowed. So she sat. The cold bit through her dress and into her skin, and she did not move. Her breath made clouds beside his clouds, and together they watched the snow and the moon and the shadow of the mountains against the stars, and they did not speak again. And when Declan finally stood and went inside, he paused in the doorway and looked back at her. He did not say thank you. He did not say anything. But his eyes, for the first time since she had met him, were not hard. They were not guarded or challenging or sharp. They were simply tired. Honestly, openly tired. And that openness was the most generous thing Declan Ashford had ever given anyone. And Sable received it the way it was offered, in silence, without ceremony, without the need to name it. From that night forward, when Declan looked at Sable, the suspicion was gone. The evenings with Phineas were something else entirely. They were quieter, more contained, lit by candlelight, and built from words rather than weather. After Cormac went to check the livestock and Declan disappeared into whatever solitary patrol he conducted in the dark, Phineas and Sable sat by the fire and talked. He read to her from his books, a small but carefully chosen collection. Poetry, history, a novel about a whaling ship that Phineas said was about more than whales, but could not explain exactly what, only that it made him feel something large and undefined, like standing on a cliff and looking down. Sable listened, and she watched his face while he read, the way his features softened, the way his voice found a rhythm that was not speech and not song, but something between the two, and she recognized it. She recognized the voice behind the letters, the intelligence, the sensitivity, the capacity for beauty that lived inside this quiet, ink-stained young man, like a flame inside a lantern, visible only when the light was right. One evening in the deepest part of winter, when the cold was so absolute that even the wind had stopped and the world outside was a cathedral of ice and silence, Phineas set his book down and looked at her directly. "I wrote those letters because Cormac asked me to," he said. "But I kept writing because for the first time in my life I felt like I was talking to someone who truly listened. Not just heard, listened. The way you listen to music with your whole body, not just your ears." Sable looked at him. The candle flame leaned between them in a draft that came from nowhere, and the space between their faces was so thin that she could feel the warmth of his breath, could see the fine lines of exhaustion around his eyes, could count the ink stains on his fingers, 3 on the right hand, 1 on the left. She turned away, not sharply, not cruelly, but deliberately, the way a person turns away from a precipice, not because they do not want to fall, but because they know they must not. "Good night, Phineas," she said. And she went upstairs and she lay in the dark and she pressed her face into the pillow so that no one would hear the sound she made, which was not crying exactly, but something close to it. The sound of a heart that knows what it wants and knows equally that wanting it would destroy the thing it loves. Because she loved this family, all of it, the cabin and the creek and the mountains and the fire and the 4 tin cups on the table every morning. She loved Cormac's silent strength and Declan's hard-won respect and Phineas's beautiful impossible words. And she understood with the clarity that only winter can provide, the clarity of a world stripped to its bones, that she could not have all of it, that choosing one thread would pull the others loose, that the fabric of this family already stretched thin by 15 years of loss and loneliness and survival could not bear the weight of the wrong choice. She had to choose right, and choosing right meant choosing with her head as much as her heart. It meant seeing clearly what each brother needed, not from her body or her affection, but from her presence in their lives, and giving each one the thing that would make him whole rather than the thing that would make him hers. It was the hardest lesson she had ever learned, harder than sewing, harder than survival, harder than the push that sent Harmon Osgood stumbling backward into his mahogany desk. And she learned it alone in the dark on a narrow cot in a cabin on a mountain while the snow fell and fell and fell. The thaw came slowly, the way forgiveness comes not all at once, but in small concessions. A drip, here, a trickle, there. The ice loosening its grip, finger by finger, until one morning the creek was singing again, and the first mud appeared on the trail like a promise. The world exhaled. Color returned, and with it danger. But Phineas, who had made the first trip down to Bitter Creek since November, came back with supplies and news, and neither was good. The supplies were thin. Several merchants had refused to sell to him. Peterson's General Store, which had been the Ashford family's primary source of flour, sugar, and ammunition for over a decade, had turned him away at the door. The hardware dealer had suddenly raised his prices to 3 times the normal rate. Even Crenshaw, the blacksmith, a man who had shod their horses for years, had looked at Phineas with an expression of mingled pity and discomfort and said, "I think it is best if you go elsewhere for a while." The news explained why. Virgil Skaggs had returned to Bitter Creek during the winter, but he had not come with guns. He had come with something far more dangerous. A man. The man's name was Elwood Creel, and he called himself a traveling preacher. He wore a black coat and carried a Bible, and spoke with the rolling, practiced cadence of a man who had memorized enough scripture to sound convincing and not enough to be questioned. He had arrived in Bitter Creek in January, when the snow was at its deepest and the town was at its most isolated and most susceptible to the particular kind of fear that masquerades as righteousness, and he had begun to preach. His subject was sin, specifically the sin being committed on the Ashford Ranch, where he informed the good people of Bitter Creek with a voice trembling with righteous indignation. 3 unmarried men were living with a young woman of questionable character, a woman who had fled the East under a cloud of suspicion, a woman without husband, without chaperone, without the sanction of God or law, sharing a roof and who knew what else with three wild men who had never set foot in a church and lived like heathens on their mountain. The accusation was devastating precisely because it was unanswerable. The truth that Sable slept in a separate room, that she was treated with respect, that nothing improper had occurred did not matter. In a frontier community in the 1870s, reputation was currency. It was credit at the store. It was help during harvest. It was the difference between surviving a hard winter and being left to face it alone. And Skaggs, with the cunning of a man who understood that bullets were crude, but stories were surgical, had aimed his weapon at the Ashford family's lifeline and pulled the trigger. Phineas told him at the dinner table, his voice careful and flat, the voice of a man delivering news he wishes were not true. Cormac listened without expression, but Sable, who had learned to read his silences the way a sailor reads the sea, saw the muscles in his jaw working, grinding against each other like millstones, and she knew that behind his stillness, something was building. Declan stood up so fast his chair hit the wall behind him. "I will go down there and I will put my fist through that false preacher's teeth," he said, and his voice was not loud, but it vibrated with a frequency that Sable recognized as dangerous. The frequency of a man who had spent 15 years converting grief into muscle and was looking for a place to spend it. "No," Cormac said. "No, they are starving us out, Cormac. You understand that no supplies, no trade, and come next winter, we are dead." I said no. The two brothers stared at each other across the table, and for a moment the cabin felt like a space between two thunderclouds charged and waiting. Then Declan turned and walked out, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the plates on the shelf Cormac had built for Sable's Bible, and the sound echoed through the cabin and out into the valley and came back as silence. That night, Sable lay awake and made a decision. She did not discuss it with Cormac. She did not ask permission. She did not consult anyone, because this was not a problem that belonged to the Ashford brothers. It belonged to her. She was the reason Skaggs had come. She was the reason Creel was preaching. She was the wound that the town was trying to cut out, and if the knife was aimed at her, then she would face it herself. Before dawn, she dressed in the cleanest dress she owned. The navy blue one she had arrived in, brushed and mended, now still carrying the faint dust of a 1,000-mile journey. She braided her hair, pinned it, and fastened the small cameo brooch at her throat, the only piece of jewelry she possessed, given to her by a nun at the orphanage, who had said, "This belonged to your mother, though I cannot tell you which one." She reached for the unfinished embroidery on the kitchen wall, the wild roses that Cormac's mother had begun and never completed, and she tucked it into her dress pocket, not because she had a plan for it, but because something in her bones told her to carry it the way a soldier carries a token into battle, not for luck, but for remembrance. She saddled the chestnut mare, the one Phineas had taught her to ride, and Declan had taught her to ride well, and she led it out of the barn in the gray light of pre-dawn. Cormac was standing on the porch. Of course he was. The man slept like a sentry. Every sound in the valley passed through him before it reached anyone else. "Where are you going?" he asked. "Bitter Creek." "Alone?" "Yes." His jaw worked. His hands hanging at his sides opened and closed. She could see the struggle on his face as clearly as if it were written there, the need to protect, warring with the recognition that she had the right to fight her own battles, and that stopping her would be a different kind of imprisonment than the one she had fled. "Sable," he said, just her name. The first time he had used it without the formal prefix. It sounded different in his mouth, rougher, more intimate, as though the word itself had been waiting for him to say it. "I will be back by evening," she said. She swung up onto the horse with the confidence that 3 months of Declan's relentless instruction had given her, and she rode out of the valley without looking back, because looking back would have meant seeing his face, and seeing his face would have meant stopping, and she could not afford to stop. The ride to Bitter Creek took 3 hours. The trail was muddy from the thaw, treacherous in places, and twice the mare stumbled on loose rock, but Sable held her seat and kept going, and by mid-morning she was tying her horse to the rail outside the small clapboard church at the end of Main Street. She could hear a Creel's voice from outside, rolling and sonorous, bouncing off the thin walls like a ball in a box. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The church was small, perhaps 20 people seated on rough-hewn pews, and they all turned when the door opened. Sable saw their faces. She recognized some from her arrival: the blacksmith Crenshaw, the woman who ran the boarding house, 2 ranchers from the valley below, and she saw Creel at the front standing behind a pulpit that was really just a wooden crate draped in cloth. His arms spread wide, his black coat hanging open to reveal a waistcoat that was too fine for a traveling preacher. And she knew instantly and completely that this man was a fraud. Not because of the waistcoat, because of his eyes. They were performer's eyes, constantly scanning the audience, measuring reactions, calibrating delivery. They were the eyes of a man who used words the way a pickpocket uses fingers, with precision and without conscience. Sable walked down the center aisle. She did not run. She did not hurry. She walked the way a person walks when they have decided that the distance between fear and courage is exactly the length of a church aisle, and they are going to cross it one step at a time. Creel stopped mid-sentence. The congregation stared. Sable reached the front. She turned to face the room. She clasped her hands in front of her, the way the nuns had taught her to stand when reciting scripture, and she spoke. "My name is Sable Dunmore. I came to Montana Territory through a lawful advertisement for a mail-order bride. I live at the Ashford Ranch in a private room. I have been treated with nothing but respect since the day I arrived. I am a seamstress by trade, not a criminal. I have stolen nothing. I have harmed no one." She paused. Her heart was slamming against her ribs so hard she was certain the entire room could hear it, but her voice held. The orphanage had taught her many things, and one of them was this: when you have nothing, your voice is the only weapon you carry. Use it well. She turned to Creel. "And this man is not a preacher." Creel's face went through a rapid series of adjustments. Surprise, anger. And then the smooth, practiced, calm of a professional liar regaining his footing. "My child, I am a servant of the Lord, and I—" "Then quote the 23rd Psalm," Sable said. Silence. Creel blinked. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. The Lord is my shepherd, and he guides me. He makes me lie down in green pastures." Sable said, her voice clear and steady, and carrying to every corner of that small wooden room. "He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul." She looked at the congregation. Every child in every orphanage in Boston can recite that psalm before they can write their own name. This man cannot. A murmur ran through the pews. Crenshaw the blacksmith shifted in his seat. The boarding house woman leaned forward, squinting at Creel with new eyes. Then a voice rose from the back of the church. "She is right." Temperance Boyle stood up from the last pew where she had been sitting, with her arms folded and her mouth set in the particular line of a woman who has been waiting for someone to say what she has been thinking for months. She walked to the front of the church with the deliberate stride of a 60-year-old woman who had buried 2 husbands, run a business alone for 15 years, and had long ago exhausted her capacity for foolishness. "I have known the Ashford boys since they came to this valley," Temperance said. "I sold them their first sack of flour. I watched Cormac carry his brothers on his back through a blizzard that would have killed a lesser man. They are hard-headed and wild, and they smell like horses more often than not. But they are honest, and I will not stand in this church and listen to a man I have never seen before tell me otherwise." The room did not erupt in applause. This was not that kind of town. But something shifted. A weight redistribution, invisible but real, the kind that happens when enough people in a room begin to doubt the same thing at the same time. Creel felt it. His face changed. The performer's confidence drained out of him like water from a cracked jug, and what was left was smaller, meaner, and desperate. He left Bitter Creek the next morning. No one asked him to stay. The victory was not complete. Not every person in town was convinced. Peterson's store remained closed to the Ashfords. 2 ranchers who had previously been friendly now looked away when Phineas rode through town. But the tide had turned. The story Skaggs had planted was no longer growing. It was dying slowly, the way a fire dies when you stop feeding it, and Sable had been the one to starve it. She rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon, exhausted, shaking with the aftermath of adrenaline, and found all 3 brothers on the porch waiting for her. Cormac helped her down from the horse. His hand lingered on her arm for exactly 1 second longer than necessary, and in that second, Sable felt everything he could not say. The pride, the relief, the terrified gratitude of a man watching someone he cared about walk into danger and come back alive. "It is done," she said. "Creel is finished." Declan looked at her. His arms were crossed, his jaw was tight, and for a moment she braced herself for his disapproval for the lecture about recklessness, for the reminder that she should have let them handle it. Instead, he said, "You ride better than I expected." From Declan, that was a standing ovation. And in her pocket, pressed against her hip, the unfinished embroidery lay warm from her body, heat, the wild roses still waiting, the rusted needle still hanging from its last stitch, patient as a promise that has not yet been broken and will not be. 2 weeks after Sable rode down to Bitter Creek and silenced Elwood Creel in his own pulpit, Phineas returned from town with a letter. Not from Skaggs, from Boston. A lawyer named Prentice Loomis, writing on heavy cream paper with an embossed letterhead, informed Miss Sable Dunmore that Harmon Osgood had been placed under formal investigation by a city commission following accusations from 2 additional women who had come forward with the claims of similar conduct. The charges of theft against Sable had been reviewed, found to be without merit, and officially dismissed. Her name had been removed from all warrants. She was, in the eyes of Massachusetts law, a free woman. But the letter contained something else, something that changed everything. One of the women who had testified against Osgood was the landlady of the boarding house where Sable had lived before she fled. The woman whose name was Mrs. Alderton had kept Sable's belongings after her sudden departure, including a small wooden box hidden beneath a false bottom in her trunk. Inside that box was 2 years of wages saved coin by coin from the sewing shop money Sable had hidden, because she trusted no bank and no man, and had learned early that the only safety a woman without family could rely upon was the safety she built with her own hands. The lawyer had enclosed a bank draft for the full amount. It was not a fortune, but it was enough. Enough to rent rooms in a respectable part of Boston, enough to purchase fabric and thread and the beginning of a clientele, enough to accept the position that Loomis mentioned in his final paragraph, an offer from a well-regarded dressmaker on Newbury Street who was seeking an experienced seamstress and was willing to provide lodging above the shop as part of the arrangement. Sable read the letter 3 times. Then she sat down at the kitchen table and placed it flat before her and stared at it until the words blurred. She had options. She had a future that did not involve splitting firewood or riding 3 hours through mud to buy salt or sleeping in a cabin that shook when the wind blew hard. She had a warm room with a real bed and running water and neighbors who could be reached by walking down a flight of stairs rather than riding half a day on horseback. She had everything she had dreamed of during those first terrible weeks in Boston after the orphanage released her, when she had stood on street corners with her sewing kit and her Bible and her bone comb and tried to imagine what a life that belonged to her might look like. She had a way out. The letter sat on the table through dinner, and no one mentioned it, and the silence around it was louder than any conversation. After the meal, when Sable was washing the plates in the basin, Declan spoke first. He stood by the door with his coat on, ready to go outside, and he said it without turning around, without looking at her, as though eye contact would make the words too heavy to carry. "You should go. That is a better life than anything we have got up here." Phineas said nothing. He sat by the fire with a book open on his knee, but he had not turned a page in 20 minutes, and his face was the face of a man reading his own ending. Cormac said, "The decision is yours. No one here will hold you." Sable dried her hands. She folded the cloth carefully, as though the precision of the fold mattered, as though she could impose order on her thoughts by imposing order on a dish towel. Then she went upstairs without answering. That night she heard them arguing. The sound came from the barn, muffled by distance and walls, but not enough to disguise the voices. She crept to the window that overlooked the yard. The barn door was open, lantern light spilling out in a yellow rectangle on the muddy ground, and their shadows moved inside, large and agitated. Declan's voice, rough and unguarded in a way she had never heard. "You know Phineas loves her. You know you love her. And you know what I—" He stopped. The silence that followed was the silence of a man colliding with a truth he had not expected to find in his own mouth. "I do not want her to go either." Cormac's voice heavy as the mountain. "3 of us, 1 woman. This only ends with us losing each other." Sable moved away from the window. She had heard enough. She had heard too much. And the weight of it, the knowledge that her presence in this family was simultaneously the thing holding it together and the thing threatening to tear it apart, settled on her shoulders like a physical load, and she carried it to bed, and she did not sleep. 3 days passed. 3 days of meals eaten in careful silence of work, done side by side without unnecessary words of glances, caught and quickly released, of attention so pervasive It changed the taste of the air itself. On the fourth morning, Sable set 4 cups of coffee on the table, sat down and spoke. I am not leaving. 3 faces, 3 different versions of the same shock. I am going to write to the lawyer, accept the bank draft, use the money to buy cattle, fix the barn properly, dig a well so I do not have to carry water from the creek in January. She looked at each of them in turn. Cormac, whose stillness had cracked just enough to show the hope underneath, like light through a fracture in stone. Declan, who was gripping the edge of the table with both hands as though the floor had shifted beneath him. Phineas, whose eyes were bright and unguarded for the first time since the letter arrived. I am staying, she said, not because I have no other choice. I have a choice. Boston is a choice. A warm room with running water and a proper bed, and neighbors who do not have to ride 3 hours to borrow a cup of sugar, that is a choice. She paused. But I choose here. I choose this table and these mountains and this ridiculous cabin that shakes in the wind. I choose it because you did not save me out of obligation. You saved me because you are good men, and I am not staying out of debt. I am staying because this is where I belong. Cormac nodded once, slowly. The nod of a man who has just received news he was afraid to hope for and needs a moment to believe it is real. Declan pushed back from the table and walked outside, but through the window before he turned the corner of the cabin. Sable caught the smallest movement at the corner of his mouth, upward, barely perceptible, the second smile she had ever seen on his face, and this one she would remember longer than the first. Phineas looked at her. His eyes were shining. He did not look away. And for the first time since the night she had found him writing by candlelight, the space between them did not feel like a wound. It felt like a bridge. Not one they would cross, but one that existed solid and real, connecting 2 people who understood each other completely and had chosen together to let that understanding be enough. Spring opened the valley like a hand opening after a long fist. The creek swelled with snowmelt running fast and clear. The meadow erupted in columbine and Indian paintbrush, blue and red against new green. The money from Boston arrived in late April, and the work began. Cormac and Declan felled trees and hauled timber, their axes ringing through the valley from dawn until the light failed. Phineas measured and planed and fitted joints with the same precision he brought to his handwriting. Sable kept the books recording every expense in a ledger, her neat columns of figures transforming the abstract fact of money into fence posts, nails, salt licks, and seed. She also kept the house, and the house under her hands continued its slow transformation. She rode down to Bitter Creek once a week, every week, and she visited. She visited Temperance, who had become something between a friend and a surrogate grandmother. She visited families in town bringing small gifts, a jar of preserves, a repaired dress with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible, a carved wooden animal from Phineas's collection. She sat on porches and listened to women talk about children and crops and the particular loneliness of frontier life, and she answered their questions about the Ashford brothers with a candor that disarmed suspicion more effectively than any defense could have. Are they really as big as they say? Asked Mrs. Henderson, whose husband ran the ferry crossing. Bigger, Sable said, and they treat you well. They treat me like I matter, Sable said, which is more than most people have ever done. The simplicity of that answer did more to rehabilitate the Ashford name than any argument. Peterson's store reopened its doors. Crenshaw, the blacksmith, shod their horses again, and the first time he did, he charged half his usual rate, which was his way of saying what his mouth could not. One evening in late May, hauling a fresh load of lumber up from the lower meadow, with the last of the daylight turning the sawdust on his arms to gold, Declan looked at Sable across the bed of the wagon and said, with the grudging admiration of a man conceding a point he had argued against for months, "Before you came, we survived. Now we are actually doing business." Sable smiled. "Is that a compliment?" "It is an observation," Declan said. But his mouth twitched, and she counted that as his third smile, and she was keeping count because each one was a small miracle, a crack in the stone wall he had built around himself, and she had learned that miracles, even small ones, deserve to be recorded. During one of her visits, Temperance Boyle told Sable something that she kept to herself for days, turning it over in her mind, the way Phineas turned his carvings in his hands, examining every surface before deciding what it meant. "Years ago," Temperance said, pouring coffee in the back of the store, with the particular casualness of a woman who is about to say something important and does not want it to seem that way. I received a letter from a woman named Nettie. She was asking about 3 boys in Montana, Ashford boys. The letter had no return address, just a postmark from New Mexico territory. Sable set her cup down. Did you tell them? I tried to write back. The letter came back undelivered. Temperance's face was steady, but her voice carried something fragile beneath the bluntness, the weight of a decision she had made years ago and still was not sure was right. I have always believed she was alive, but I could not give those boys hope and then take it away. That would have been worse than silence. Sable did not tell the brothers. Not yet. She folded the information and placed it in the part of her mind where she kept things that mattered, but were not yet ripe, alongside the unfinished embroidery and the word "went on away," and the amber eyes that all 3 brothers shared with a mother none of them had seen in 15 years. The conversation with Phineas happened on a Tuesday afternoon in early June. Sable had been waiting for it the way you wait for a storm. You can see building on the horizon, knowing it will come, knowing you cannot prevent it, hoping only that when it arrives, the damage will be less than you feared. She found him by the creek, sitting on the flat rock where he came to think when the cabin felt too small for whatever was inside his head. He was carving as he often did, his knife moving with small, precise strokes, and she saw as she approached that the shape emerging from the block of pine was a bird, a man. Not a songbird or a hawk or any of the small animals he usually made. This was something different. A bird with wings outstretched, caught mid-flight, every feather defined with a care that bordered on devotion, the barbs and shafts rendered with such delicacy that they seemed to move in the breeze. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen him make, and the pain on his face while he made it told her everything she needed to know about what this carving meant and who it was for. She sat beside him on the rock. The creek ran past their feet, cold and fast, with the last of the snow melt, and the sound of it filled the space between them, the way music fills a church, not to cover the silence, but to give it shape and permission. You wrote those letters, Sable said. She had said this before, months ago, in a candlelit kitchen on her first night in the cabin. But the words meant something different now. They were not an accusation or a discovery. They were an acknowledgement, a way of saying, I know what you gave me, and I know what it cost you, and I will carry the weight of that as long as I live. Phineas's knife paused on the wood. A thin curl of pine fell into his lap. He did not look up. I came to Montana because of those letters. She continued, her voice steady, choosing each word the way he chose his cuts, with precision and intention. And I stayed because of more than letters. But I want you to know that what you wrote, the things you said about the stars being close enough to touch, about silence being a language, about wanting someone to share the quiet, with those words are the reason I am here. Those words saved my life. When I was in Boston, when I had nothing and no one, and the walls of that boarding house were so thin I could hear the woman next door crying herself to sleep every night, your words were the only thing that made me believe there was something worth walking toward. Phineas was quiet for a long time. The creek talked over the stones in its bed, saying the same thing it had been saying for 10,000 years, which was nothing and everything. A hawk circled overhead, riding a thermal with its wings locked, its shadow passing over them like a benediction. And somewhere in the meadow below, a meadowlark sang its liquid, rising song, and the world was so beautiful that it hurt. Then Phineas spoke, and his voice was steady, steadier than she had expected. The voice of a man who had spent the long winter wrestling with something larger than himself and had finally pinned it to the ground, not by force but by acceptance, which was a different kind of strength and a harder one to find. Cormac will die for you, he said. I know that because I know my brother. He will stand between you and anything that comes, and he will not move. And if it kills him, he will consider it a fair trade. That is who he is. That is how he loves. With his body, with his hands, with the physical fact of himself placed between the thing he loves and the thing that threatens it. He turned the bird in his hands, examining the wing he had been shaping, running his thumb along the edge of a feather that was so thin it was nearly translucent. The pine was pale and warm, the color of morning light, and the bird seemed to glow from within, as though the tree it came from had stored years of sunlight in its grain, and Phineas's knife had released it. I would write about you, he continued. I would put you in sentences that would make people weep. I would describe the way the light catches your hair in the morning when you stand by the window. The way your voice sounds when you hum that hymn while you build the fire like something fragile being carried across water. The way you hold a cup of coffee in both hands as though it is the only warm thing in the world and you are afraid it will cool. I would write all of it and it would be true. All of it and it would be beautiful. But that is how I love. In words, on paper, at a distance that keeps the words safe. He looked at her then, and his amber eyes, so like his brother's eyes and so different, carrying the same color, but a different light, were clear and calm and full of something that was not quite sadness, but was adjacent to it, the way a shadow is adjacent to the thing that casts it. You need someone who will live for you, not die, not write, live. Get up every morning and build the fire and mend the fence and hold your hand when the wind blows hard and still be there when the wind stops. Cormac is that man. He has always been that man. He just needed my words to reach you. Sable felt tears building behind her eyes, not the tears of grief, but the tears that come when you witness an act of courage so quiet and so costly that the only appropriate response is reverence. Phineas was not retreating or surrendering. He was choosing his brother over his own heart, choosing the wholeness of his family over the fragment of it that he wanted for himself. And the grace of that choice, the sheer moral weight of it, encompassed not just Sable, but Cormac and Declan, and the cabin and the mountains and the entire fragile architecture of a family that had survived so much and could not survive being torn apart from within. Phineas, she whispered. He held up the bird, a sound. Finished now, wings wide. Every feather precise, each one distinct the way words in a well-made sentence are distinct and each carrying its own weight and contributing to the whole. He placed it in her hands and his fingers brushed hers and she felt the warmth of him and the calluses from his knife and the faint tremor that he could not quite control. And she held the bird and she held all of it, the beauty and the loss and the rightness and the barst. Every letter I wrote you, and he said, I imagine this bird, small, strong, not afraid to fly far from where it started, not afraid to land somewhere new. Sable closed her fingers around the carving and held it against her chest, against the place where her heart was doing something complicated and painful and necessary, the work of letting go of one thing so that she could hold on to another. And between them something closed, gently, respectfully, without shattering. The way a book closes when you have finished reading it and loved it and know you will never read it again, but will keep it on the shelf forever within reach, within memory, honored by its placement among the things you cannot throw away. Phineas told her the rest that evening after dinner, while the dishes cooled in the basin and the fire settled into its nightly conversation with itself. He had been thinking about it all winter, he said. Bitter Creek had no school teacher. The children of the valley grew up knowing how to shoe a horse and gut a deer and read the weather in the shape of clouds, but not how to read a book or write their names or put a thought into a sentence that could travel farther than the sound of their own voice. He could do something about that. He could take the gift of language, the gift that had reached across 1,000 miles and brought Sable to a stagecoach stop in a town she had never heard of, and he could give it to children who had never held a pen. He could teach them to read, to write, to know that the world was larger than the valley they could see from their front porches, and that the door to that larger world was made of paper and ink and 26 letters arranged in infinite combinations. He was not leaving his family. He was extending it, drawing the boundary wider so that it included not just the valley and the cabin and the four of them, but the town below and the people in it and the future that those children would carry forward. Cormac said nothing when Phineas told him. He looked at his youngest brother for a long time, the firelight moving across both their faces, and something passed between them that was too old and too deep for language. A conversation conducted entirely in the dialect of men who had raised each other in the wilderness and who understood, without needing to say it, that the bonds between them were not weakened by distance, but strengthened by purpose. Then Cormac nodded. Once, and put his hand on Phineas's shoulder, and the weight of that hand, heavy and warm and certain, said everything his mouth could not, which was, I am proud of you and I will miss you, and you are doing the right thing, and I love you, all of it, compressed into the pressure of 5 fingers on a shoulder, a gesture so simple and so full that it cracked the air around it. Declan said, You are going to teach children, you. His voice carried the particular incredulity of a man whose younger brother had just announced he was joining the circus. And then he laughed. Not the short, humorless bark that Sable had heard before, but a real laugh full and warm and startled out of him against his will, the way a bird is startled out of a bush, sudden and awkward and alive. God help those kids. But he was smiling when he said it, smile number 4, and this time he did not bother to hide it. The evening Sable chose to speak to Cormac was a Thursday in late June when the days were long and generous, and the light lasted until nearly 10 o'clock, and the mountains turned pink and then purple, and then a blue so dark it was almost black against the sky that refused to darken completely, as though the sun itself could not bear to leave this valley where something important was about to happen. She found him at the far end of the ranch, mending the fence that marked the western boundary of their property. He worked alone as he always did, the hammer rising and falling in steady rhythm, each strike precise, each nail driven flush. With the wood in a single blow, he did not waste motion, he did not hurry, he built things the way he lived with patience and permanence, as though every fence post was a promise and every nail an oath, and the act of maintenance was itself a form of devotion, a way of saying, I am still here, I am still building, I have not given up. Sable stood at the edge of the meadow and watched him for a moment before he saw her. The light was behind him, catching the dust motes in the air and turning them to gold. And in that light, with his sleeves rolled to his elbows and his hat pushed back and the honest sweat on his brow catching the last of the sun, he looked like something carved from the mountain itself, rough and weathered and immovable and more real than anything she had ever seen. Not beautiful in the way that word was used in Boston in the parlors and the storefronts. Beautiful in a different way. Beautiful in the way a bridge is beautiful, or a dam, or a wall built to hold back a flood. Functional beauty, structural beauty, the beauty of a thing that does what it was made to do and does it completely and without apology. Cormac. He turned. The hammer stopped. He looked at her with those amber eyes, and she saw the same thing in them that she had seen the first day. The same careful, guarded hope of a man who had been disappointed so profoundly that he had learned to hold hope at arm's length, close enough to see its face, but not close enough to feel its warmth. Because warmth, when it was taken away, left a cold that was worse than any cold that had come before. I want to stay, she said. Not as a guest, no as the woman who cooks and keeps the books and sews the curtains. As your wife, if you still want that. Cormac set the hammer down. He placed it on the fence post, carefully, the way a man places a weapon when he wants to show that his hands are empty, that he is unarmed, that what comes next will be conducted without armor or shield, or any of the protections he had spent his adult life constructing. He looked at her for a long time. The evening light moved across his face like a hand, and she saw everything he had hidden beneath the silence, and the duty, the loneliness, the hope, the terrified wanting of a man who believed that wanting things for himself was an indulgence he could not afford. He stepped toward her. He took her hands. His palms were rough and calloused and warm-scarred from 20 years of axes and hammers and ropes and the 1,000 abrasions of a life lived outdoors, and they closed around her fingers with a gentleness that seemed impossible for their size, the gentleness of a man who understood that the most important things in life were also the most fragile, and that holding them required more strength than holding heavy things, because heavy things only needed force, but fragile things needed calibration, precision, the ability to apply exactly the right amount of pressure and not 1 ounce more. I have wanted that since the first day, he said, his voice cracked. Not dramatically, but in the way a stone cracks when water has been seeping into it for years, and one day the surface gives way, and what was hidden underneath is suddenly exposed. I just did not dare believe. Sable placed her hand against his chest, over his heart. She could feel it beating beneath the worn cotton of his shirt, steady and strong, and faster than its usual rhythm, because Cormac Ashford, who was not afraid of blizzards or bullets, or 3 armed men at his fence line, was afraid of this, afraid of joy, afraid of the possibility that something good could happen to him and not be taken away. Then start believing, she said. He leaned down. His forehead touched hers. They stood there in the last light of the longest evening she had ever known, not kissing, not moving, just breathing. His breath and her breath meeting in the warm air between them. Mingling, becoming one, in the intimacy of it was more profound than any ceremony, and more binding than any vow. The wedding took place on a Saturday morning in early July, in the meadow beside the creek under a sky so blue and so deep and so perfectly cloudless that it looked like a promise made visible. Reverend Abernathy, a genuine preacher from 2 valleys over, a lean sun-dried man with kind eyes and enormous ears, and a voice like distant thunder, rode 5 hours to perform the ceremony, and he did so with the brevity and sincerity of a man who understood that God was in the mountains, in the creek, in the faces of the people standing before him. Declan wore the cleanest clothes he owned, a dark shirt buttoned to the collar for possibly the first time in its existence, and trousers that appeared to have been pressed, though how he had managed this without an iron remained a mystery. His jaw was set, his back was ramrod straight, and his eyes were suspiciously bright, though anyone who mentioned this fact aloud would have received a response delivered not with words, but with a fist the size of a ham. Phineas wore his only good coat, brushed and aired, and still slightly too long in the sleeves. He carried a sheet of paper folded in his breast pocket, and when the Reverend nodded to him, he unfolded it with hands that trembled, and he read. 4 lines. That was all. He had spent 3 days writing them, crossing out and rewriting and crossing out again, filling the margins with alternatives that he rejected one by one until only these 4 remained, distilled down to their essence the way whiskey is distilled, all the excess burned away until what was left was pure and strong and unmistakable. His voice shook. 4 lines, and each word carried the weight of everything he had chosen to give, and everything he had chosen to release, and everyone who stood in that meadow heard what was in those 4 lines. Temperance Boyle, who had ridden up the mountain on a borrowed mule with a cake balanced on her lap for 4 hours without dropping it or losing her dignity. 2 neighboring ranchers and their wives who had decided finally that the Ashford family deserved their respect. Even old Gulliver Nye, the stagecoach driver, who had come uninvited and stood at the back with his hat in his hands and his jaw working the way it did when he was moved. Every one of them carried the feeling home the way you carry the warmth of a fire in your bones after the fire itself has gone out. Sable wore a white dress she had sewn herself from cotton purchased at Temperance's store, simple and clean, with small pearl buttons she had saved from the Boston sewing shop, and lace at the collar that she had tatted by hand during the long winter evenings. The cameo brooch from the orphanage was at her throat. Her honey blonde hair was braided and pinned with wildflowers, columbine and paintbrush, blue and red against the gold. When she walked across the meadow toward Cormac, the grass brushing her hem, the creek singing behind her, the mountains standing witness on every side, she looked like something that had always been here, something the valley had been holding a place for, a missing piece finally fitted into a puzzle that had been incomplete for longer than anyone could remember. Cormac watched her come. His face was open in a way she had never seen, every wall removed, every gate standing wide, the entire fortification that he had spent 15 years constructing, dismantled in the time it took a woman in a white dress to walk across a meadow. The Reverend spoke the words. They said their vows. And when the moment came, Cormac leaned down and kissed her gently, briefly, the way rain touches the surface of a creek, and she tasted salt on his lips. The salt of a man who had waited half his life for permission to be happy and was still not entirely sure the permission was real. Phineas clapped his brother on the back. Declan shook Cormac's hand with a grip that could have crushed granite, then turned to Sable and inclined his head in a single formal, almost courtly nod, the kind of acknowledgement that a man of fierce pride gives to a woman who has earned his respect through means he did not expect and cannot fully explain. Temperance's cake was dry. Nobody mentioned it. The afternoon unfolded in quiet celebration beside the creek, and by evening the guests had gone and the valley was theirs, and everything between Cormac and Sable that had been held at arm's length was finally allowed to close. The rest belonged to them alone, and the mountains kept their counsel, and the creek sang its night song, and the stars pressed close against the dark sky like witnesses who understood that some things are sacred precisely because they are private. When morning came, the narrow cot upstairs was no longer the bed of a guest, but the bed of a wife, and the cabin was no longer a shelter, but a home. And the difference between those two things, which had always been obvious and absolute, was now finally resolved. 1 week after the wedding, Skaggs came back. Sable heard the horse before she saw it. She was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin sheets that snapped in the afternoon breeze like white flags, and the sound of hooves on the trail was wrong. Not the steady, confident rhythm of a healthy horse. This was irregular, labored, the sound of an animal pushed beyond its limits by a rider who had nowhere else to go. She came around the corner of the cabin and stopped. The horse was a bay mare, thin, lathered head, hanging so low its nose nearly touched the ground, and the man on its back was Virgil Skaggs. But not the Skaggs she remembered. The man who had ridden up to the Ashford fence line in autumn, with 4 armed men at his back and a warrant in his pocket, had been replaced by something diminished and desperate. His canvas duster was torn. His face was gaunt. His hat was gone. His rifle was gone. There was dried blood on his collar and a bruise the color of a thundercloud along the left side of his jaw, and he rode the way men ride when they have run out of places to run, hunched forward, gripping the saddle horn, looking behind them more than ahead. Cormac appeared on the porch, then Declan from the barn, then Phineas, who had ridden up from Bitter Creek for his weekly visit and was still unsaddling his horse. Skaggs pulled the mare to a stop at the gate. He did not dismount. He sat there swaying slightly and looked at Cormac with eyes that had lost their calculating sharpness and had been replaced by the flat, exhausted terror of a hunted animal. "I know I have no right," Skaggs said. His voice was a rasp, scraped thin by dehydration. "But they are going to kill me." The story came out in fragments. 2 federal bounty agents had been tracking Skaggs across 3 territories for crimes that dwarfed his pursuit of Sable: kidnapping, extortion, forgery of court documents, assault of a deputy marshal in Wyoming. They had caught up with him 2 days ago south of Bitter Creek. He had escaped by riding into a box canyon and climbing out on foot while they shot at him, leaving his supplies, his rifle, and his dignity behind. "If you hand me over, they will hang me on the spot," Skaggs said. "They are not lawmen, they are executioners." Declan moved first. He stepped forward, his body coiled, every line of him saying, "Throw him out," every muscle saying, "Make him pay." Sable saw in the set of his shoulders, in the angle of his chin, the 15-year-old boy who had been told to run when he wanted to fight and who had spent 15 years waiting for the chance to stop running and start swinging. "No," Declan said, low and tight and absolute. "He does not get water. He does not get mercy. He gets nothing from us." Cormac stood on the porch with his face unreadable, weighing it, placing Skaggs's sins on one side of the scale and something else on the other, something that had no name but had a weight, and the scale was not tipping. Sable stepped off the porch. She walked past Declan, past the laundry line, past the sheets that had stopped snapping, in a wind that had suddenly died, and she stood in front of Skaggs's horse and looked up at the man who had tried to take her freedom and destroy the family that had given her one. In his eyes, beneath the fear and the exhaustion, she saw something she recognized. She had seen it in her own reflection in the weeks after she fled Boston. It was shame, the real thing. The deep, corrosive shame of a person who has finally run out of justifications and is left standing in front of the raw fact of what they have become. "Give him water," Sable said. "Bandage his cuts, then take him to the sheriff in Bitter Creek. Properly, lawfully. Let the court decide." Declan turned sharply. "He does not deserve the law." Sable looked at him, and her voice, though quiet, carried the certainty of a woman who had been on the wrong end of false justice and understood the difference between vengeance and righteousness. "That is what Harmon Osgood decided about me, that I did not deserve due process, that I deserved to be hunted based on the word of a man with money and power. If we do the same thing, we are no different." The meadow was quiet. The creek ran. The sheets hung still. Declan stared at her, his jaw working, the muscles in his neck standing out like cords. Then his shoulders dropped. Not in defeat, in recognition. The recognition of a man confronting a truth he does not like but cannot deny. Cormac nodded, once, the nod that settled things. They gave Skaggs water. Phineas cleaned and bandaged the cut on his head with the same careful hands that carved birds and wrote letters. Declan stood in the corner of the barn with his arms folded and his eyes burning, his presence a reminder and a promise that said, clearly and without ambiguity, "If you give me a reason, any reason, I will end this differently." In the late afternoon, Declan saddled his horse and rode Skaggs down to Bitter Creek. He delivered him to the sheriff's office, waited while the paperwork was completed, and rode back up the mountain in the dark. He arrived after midnight, sat down at the table where Sable had left a plate of food for him, and ate in silence. When he finished, he looked at her across the table. "I hate that you were right," he said. Sable waited. "But you were right." That was all. He stood, put his plate in the basin, and went to bed. But those 6 words were the closest thing to a declaration of love that Declan Ashford was capable of producing, and Sable received them as such, and she kept them the way she kept Phineas's bird and Cormac's shelf and Declan's firewood in the part of her heart reserved for things that were given without expectation and received without condition. The woman appeared on a Thursday in early September when the aspens had turned full gold, and the air carried the sweet, melancholy smell of summer ending, and the valley was painted in colors so vivid they looked like a fever dream. Phineas saw her first. He had ridden up from Bitter Creek that morning earlier than usual, carrying a bundle of his students' drawings to pin on the kitchen wall, the wall where the unfinished embroidery hung beside crooked letters and stick figures, and the growing evidence that something good was happening in the town below. He was in the barn unbuckling his saddlebag when a movement at the tree line caught his eye. A woman, standing where the trail emerged from the forest half in shadow, half in the slanting morning light. She was thin in a way that went beyond slenderness, the thinness of deprivation of years of insufficient food and excessive labor, a body that had been used up by the life it contained and held together only by the stubbornness of the spirit inside it. Her hair was silver pulled back from a face that was weathered and lined and older than its years, but not yet old, held back from old by something in the set of the jaw and the straightness of the spine, and the way her hands clasped in front of her dress were still, rather than trembling, as though she had marshaled every remaining ounce of composure for this moment and would not waste it on shaking. But it was her eyes. Even from across the yard, even through the dust in the distance and the morning haze, Phineas could see her eyes. Amber, pure, unmistakable, irreplaceable amber. The color of raw honey held up to sunlight. The color of autumn leaves at their peak. The color that looked back at him every time he saw his brothers' faces or his own reflection in the creek. The Ashford amber. His mother's amber. The amber she had given to all three of her sons, along with her blood and her milk and her mom and her absence. The saddlebag slipped from his fingers. The buckle struck the barn floor with a sound like a bell. He walked out into the sunlight on legs that felt borrowed from someone else, someone younger and more fragile, someone who had not yet learned that the world was capable of both taking everything and giving it back. He stopped 10 feet from her, his mouth opened. No sound came. The woman looked at him. Her eyes moved over his face with the slow, hungry precision of a person reading something they have waited 15 years to read, memorizing every word, every line, every mark of weather and time. And something in her expression broke, not dramatically, quietly, the way ice breaks on a creek in early spring, a single crack running through something that has been frozen too long, releasing what was trapped beneath. Phineas, she said, his name, spoken in a voice he had not heard since he was 7 years old, a voice that had sung him to sleep in a house that no longer existed, a voice that had called him in from the yard for supper on evenings that he could barely remember except as warmth and safety and the smell of bread. A voice that had screamed on the night the world ended, screamed while Declan's arms wrapped around his chest and lifted him and carried him running into darkness, screamed until the distance and the trees and the pounding of blood in his ears had swallowed it. "Ma," he whispered, and the word broke open inside him like a seed that had been buried too long and had finally impossibly found its way to light. Declan came out of the cabin. He had heard the buckle fall the way he heard everything the man who slept with one ear pressed to the frequency of danger. He stood on the porch and his face went blank. Not angry, not shocked. Blank. Erased. As though every emotion he possessed had been summoned at once and canceled each other out, leaving nothing but the raw surface of a man confronting something his mind had categorized as impossible. He came down the steps. He crossed the yard. He did not run. Running would mean admitting that he needed something. But his walk was faster than any walk Sable had ever seen from him, his stride eating the ground, his boots striking the dirt with the urgency that his face refused to show. When he reached the woman, he stopped. And his hands opened and closed at his sides 3 times, 4 times, 5, as though they were trying to remember how to do something they had forgotten, some gesture that had been natural when he was 15 and had been lost in the years of clenching and guarding and holding everything at arm's length. Then he put his arms around her. The man who did not touch. The man who flinched when hands came near him. The man who had built walls so thick and so high that even his own brothers could not see over them. He put his arms around his mother, and he pulled her against his chest, and he held her with the desperate, crushing, absolute grip of a man who had finally stopped running, who had finally turned around, who had finally let his legs carry him toward the thing he had been running from, instead of away from it, and the sound he made against her silver hair was not a word in any language, but was understood by the mountains and the creek and the hawks and the wind and every living thing in the valley that witnessed it. Cormac came last. He came from the far pasture where he had been walking the fence line. He came over the ridge at his usual pace, and then he saw them, Declan holding a woman, Phineas standing beside them with his hands over his face, and he stopped. He stood on the ridge silhouetted against the morning sky, and for a long moment he did not move. Then he came down the slope, slowly at first, then faster, then slowly again. His body could not decide between the need to reach her and the terror that she would disappear, that this was the dream he had dreamed 1,000 nights in 15 years of sleeping alone. The dream where his mother walked out of the trees and said his name and was real and warm and alive. And then he woke up and she was gone, and the cabin was dark and the only sound was the wind. He stopped 5 feet away. His chest was heaving. His eyes were red and wet. His hands, those enormous hands that had built everything, the cabin, the barn, the fence, the life, were shaking in a way that he could not control and would not try to. Sable stood in the cabin doorway. She saw the paralysis. She understood it. She understood that for Cormac, this moment was not simply the return of his mother. It was the return of the boy he had been before she was taken to Mall, who had a family and a home and a future that included something other than duty and endurance. It was the return of hope itself, and hope for Cormac. Ashford was the most terrifying thing in the world. She walked to her husband. She placed her hand on the small of his back, and she pushed, gently, the way you push a gate that is already unlocked, the way you push a boat from the shore into the current, the way you push a man toward the thing he wants most in the world and is most afraid to reach for. Cormac stepped forward, and Nettie Ashford, who had survived raiders and captivity and 7 years of searching and 112 miles on foot through the Bitterroot Valley with no shoes and no map and nothing to guide her but a postmark on a returned letter, and the unshakable, irrational, magnificent conviction that her sons were alive and waiting, opened her arms and received her oldest child. The sound she made was beyond language. It was the sound of 15 years collapsing into a single moment, the sound of a door opening that had been locked so long the hinges had rusted, the sound of a river that had been dammed, finally breaking free and running clear and clean and unstoppable toward the sea. Cormac buried his face in his mother's shoulder and wept. The man who had never raised his voice above a murmur. The man who had led with silence and strength and the absolute refusal to show what was breaking inside him. He wept with the totality of a man who had been carrying the world on his back for 15 years and had finally been given permission to set it down. The story emerged over the course of the evening. The raiders had taken Nettie south to a ranch in the New Mexico territory where she had been kept as labor for 8 years. When the rancher died of cholera, his widow had released her. She had spent 7 years searching, working in towns along the way, sleeping in barns and church basements, and once for 3 weeks in a cave in the Bitterroot Range when a snowstorm caught her between towns. The thing that finally guided her home was a letter she had sent years ago to a general store in a town she could barely remember, addressed to a woman whose name she had heard once from a passing trader. The letter had been returned undeliverable, but on the envelope was a postmark, Bitter Creek, Montana territory. She had carried that envelope for years, and when she reached Helena, cooking in a miner's boarding house, she had asked for directions. She had walked 112 miles. When she reached Bitter Creek, she had gone to the general store because it was the biggest building, and Temperance Boyle had looked at her eyes and known. "Those are Ashford eyes," Temperance had said. "I would know them in the dark." And Sable understood then, sitting at the table with her hand on her husband's arm, feeling the tremors still running through his body, that the letter Temperance had told her about, the letter from New Mexico, with no return address, had been the thread connecting past to present all along. That Temperance had carried the knowledge of Nettie's survival for years, uncertain whether hope was a gift or a cruelty, and that now finally the question had been answered. The weeks that followed were weeks of mending. Not of buildings or fences, but of something older and deeper, the invisible architecture of a family that had been shattered and scattered, and was now piece by careful piece being reassembled. Nettie moved into the new room. Declan furnished it with a bed he built himself, sanded until the wood was smooth as river stone, and a shelf mounted on the wall at the exact height that his mother could reach without stretching. He did these things without being asked, and when Sable commented on the craftsmanship, he shrugged and said, "Old woman needs a proper place." And he said old woman the way other men said sweetheart, and his ears turned red, which was smile number 5, though it was not on his mouth, but on the rest of his face, which was close enough. Phineas came up from Bitter Creek every weekend, his saddlebags filled with books and newspapers, and the small gifts his students made for him, drawings on slate, and carved animals that imitated his own style, with the earnest clumsiness of children, and letters written in improving handwriting that he pinned to the kitchen wall until it was covered entirely a mosaic of crooked letters and stick figures and misspelled magnificence. Nettie helped Sable in the kitchen and in the garden. She moved carefully, her body bearing the evidence of what it had endured, but her hands were sure and her knowledge was deep, and she taught Sable things that could not be learned from books: how to make bread rise in thin mountain air, how to read the creek for the first signs of freeze, how to preserve summer in jars of berry jam that would taste like sunlight when the snow was 3 feet deep. And she told stories, not about the lost years which she kept locked away in a room inside herself that none of them tried to enter, but about before, about a ranch in the South with a red door, about a man named Everett Ashford who was tall and quiet and kind, about 3 boys, one serious, one wild, one watchful, who had been the center of her world, and the reason she had walked 112 miles on bleeding feet through a wilderness that should have killed her. One morning Nettie stood before the kitchen wall and saw the unfinished embroidery. The wild roses she had begun 15 years ago on a different ranch in a different life. She reached out and touched the cloth, her fingers finding the last stitch, the rusted needle still hanging where she had left it. Her eyes filled, and for a long moment she stood perfectly still, and no one in the room breathed. Then she sat down. She took a needle from Sable's sewing kit. She threaded it with red, and she began to stitch, continuing the rows exactly where she had stopped. Her hands remembering what her mind had tried to forget, the muscle memory of motherhood, carrying her fingers through a pattern that 15 years and 1,000 miles had not been able to erase. Sable watched her work, and something in her chest that she had not known was broken, quietly, carefully, without fanfare, began to heal. It was September when Sable told Cormac. The evening was warm, the aspens were gold, the creek ran slow and clear. She took his hand and placed it on her stomach and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said, because his hand knew. His fingers spread gently, carefully, as though touching something so precious and so fragile that even the pressure of breath could damage it. And he looked at her with an expression that contained everything, every emotion a human heart is capable of holding compressed into a single moment, and a single face, and a pair of amber eyes that were no longer guarded, no longer careful, no longer afraid. "Are you?" he said, and could not finish because the sentence was too large for his throat. "Yes." He closed his eyes. He kept his hand where it was. And he stood there in the golden light of a September evening, with his hand on his wife's belly, and his eyes closed and his lips moving slightly, and Sable realized he was not counting or praying or speaking. He was just breathing, just standing in the center of his life and breathing and allowing himself for the first time in 15 years to believe that the ground beneath him was solid and would hold. Inside the cabin, warm light glowed through the calico curtains she had sewn 9 months ago from scraps of cloth and hope. The sound of voices drifted through the open door, Nettie and Phineas talking in the kitchen, and the shorter, rougher notes of Declan adding something that made his mother laugh. And the laugh was the sound of a woman who had walked through fire and 15 years of darkness and had found her sons alive and her family whole and a grandchild on the way. "If it is a girl, we name her Nettie," Cormac said. "And if it is a boy—" He was quiet for a moment. The creek ran, the hawks circled, the aspens shivered gold. "Name him anything. Just make sure he knows he is loved." Sable leaned into his chest. His arms went around her. The creek sang its evening song. The mountains stood their watch, and she spoke softly, her words meant for the child growing inside her, but offered to the valley and the sky, and the man whose heartbeat she could feel beneath her cheek. "You will grow up with a father who will teach you the strength of silence. 2 uncles, one who will teach you never to be afraid, and one who will teach you to love words the way you love air and water and light. And a grandmother who walked 100 miles to find her family, and who will teach you by her life and not just her words that nothing in this world, no distance, no darkness, no amount of time can keep the people who love you from coming home. Cormac's arms tightened. He rested his chin on the top of her head. The creek kept running. The mountains kept their counsel. And in a small cabin in a hidden valley in the Montana Territory, a family that had been scattered by violence and rebuilt by choice and held together by a love that was not perfect, but was real. Not easy, but was certain. Not loud, but was deep as the roots of the mountains themselves sat together around a table covered with a checkered cloth that a woman from Boston had sewn from scraps. And on the wall above them, pinned in crooked rows, were the letters of children learning to write. And beside them finished at last an embroidery of wild roses in red and blue thread, completed by the same hands that had started it 15 years before in a house with a red door. And the calico curtains moved in the evening breeze, blue flowers on cream, and the fire settled in the hearth, and the coffee was warm, and the door was closed but not locked, because there was nothing left to keep out, and nothing left to fear, and everything to hold close. The river ran on, peaceful, like a name, like a life, like something finally truly irreversibly home.